Ravenna, northern Italy, January 49 BC. Sometime after nightfall, Julius Caesar left a dinner party without announcing where he was going. Only a few men accompanied him. Behind them, somewhere beyond the marshes and winter roads, soldiers of the 13th Legion waited for orders they could not take back. Ahead lay a shallow river called the Rubicon, a boundary so small that an armored man could cross it without difficulty, yet so dangerous that no Roman commander was permitted to bring an army beyond it. The danger did not come from the water. On one bank, Caesar remained the lawful governor of his provinces, protected by his office and surrounded by troops he was entitled to command. On the other, he would become a general leading armed men into Italy without the Senate's authority. The moment his soldiers crossed, every magistrate in Rome would have to choose whether to submit, negotiate, flee, or fight. Romans who had spent years conquering foreign peoples would turn their weapons against one another. Caesar's journey did not begin like the march of an invading army. According to the later account of Suetonius, he had spent part of that day in public, watching a performance and examining plans for a gladiatorial school. He then dined with company, as though nothing unusual were about to happen. When darkness gave him cover, he slipped away in a hired carriage, apparently taking minor roads to avoid attention. At one point, the party lost its way and wandered until a local guide led them back toward the river. Tradition remembered Caesar speaking of a cast of dice. One version gives the familiar words, "the die is cast." Another suggests something closer to, "let the die be cast." No witness left a record that can settle what he actually said. What matters is that the hesitation ended. The column moved, and Roman soldiers crossed the Rubicon under Caesar's command. By dawn, the Republic had not yet fallen. The Senate still met, elections still existed, and Pompey the Great remained the most celebrated commander alive. Caesar possessed only a fraction of his army, while his enemies could draw on Italy, Spain, Africa, Greece, and the wealthy kingdoms of the East. Yet he had taken the one advantage none of them could recover. He had acted first. A few days earlier, Mark Antony had been in Rome watching the political system close around Caesar. Antony held the office of tribune of the plebs, a magistracy whose protection Romans regarded as sacred. Beside him stood another tribune, Quintus Cassius Longinus, while Gaius Scribonius Curio carried Caesar's proposals into a Senate dominated not by a single opinion, but by fear, rivalry, and men who believed delay had become more dangerous than war. On January 1st, Caesar's letter was read aloud before the senators. He offered to surrender his command if Pompey did the same. The proposal sounded balanced, and that was precisely what made it dangerous to his enemies. Pompey held extraordinary military authority and controlled the Spanish provinces through subordinates while remaining in Italy. If both men laid down their commands together, Caesar could return without placing himself completely at the mercy of those preparing to prosecute him. The consuls for the new year, Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crus and Gaius Claudius Marcellus, had no intention of giving him that protection. Metellus Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law, demanded that Caesar dismiss his army by a fixed date or be treated as an enemy of the state. More cautious senators sought time for negotiation, but the men pressing for action controlled the meeting. Pompey's presence outside the debate gave their threats weight. He had not yet drawn a sword, but everyone knew whose reputation stood behind them. Antony and Cassius used their tribunician veto. Under ordinary circumstances, that act should have stopped the measure and forced another round of political maneuvering. Instead, on January 7th, the Senate adopted its emergency decree, calling on the magistrates to protect the Republic from harm. Such a decree had been used before, when Rome's ruling class believed normal restraints were no longer sufficient. To Caesar's supporters, it carried an unmistakable warning. Antony, Cassius, and Curio left Rome. Ancient accounts later emphasized the indignity of their escape, portraying tribunes driven from the city whose people they were elected to defend. The details were politically useful to Caesar, but the flight itself was real. When the men reached him in northern Italy, they brought more than news. Their arrival gave him faces to place before his soldiers, and an injury he could present as an attack on Rome's oldest protections. The fear surrounding Caesar's decision had been shaped by an earlier Roman civil war. In 88 BC, Lucius Cornelius Sulla had done what Romans once regarded as unthinkable. After political enemies tried to take away his command, he turned his legions toward Rome. He entered the city by force, later returned as victor, and published lists of men who could be killed while their property was seized. Caesar had been a young man during Sulla's dictatorship. Because of his family connections to Sulla's enemies, he had been ordered to divorce his wife, Cornelia. He refused, lost property, went into hiding, and survived only after influential people intervened. Caesar had not spent the intervening years waiting for safety. He borrowed heavily, cultivated crowds, staged public games, won election after election, and attached his future to two of the most powerful men in Rome. Pompey had returned from the east after defeating King Mithridates, reorganizing territories and extending Roman influence across a vast region. Marcus Licinius Crassus possessed immense wealth and political connections. Around 60 BC, the three men formed the alliance, later called the First Triumvirate. For a time, the arrangement worked because each man needed the others. Then the balance began to disappear. Julia died in 54 BC, severing the most personal connection between Caesar and Pompey. The following year, Crassus invaded Parthia and was killed after the disaster at Carrhae. Without him, there was no third man powerful enough to keep the other two from measuring themselves against each other. Success in Gaul also made him vulnerable. His campaigns brought wealth and glory, but political enemies questioned the legality of actions taken before and during his command. As long as Caesar held imperium, he possessed immunity from ordinary prosecution. He planned to move from his provincial command into a second consulship without spending an interval as a private citizen. His enemies sought the opposite: disarm him first, bring him home, and force him to answer charges without soldiers or office protecting him. In December 50 BC, a large majority in the Senate had supported Curio's proposal that both Caesar and Pompey surrender their commands. Consul Gaius Marcellus rejected the result and went to Pompey with a sword, ceremonially calling on him to defend the Republic. Pompey accepted the charge, though he continued to speak as if a settlement might still be possible. He had reportedly boasted that wherever he stamped his foot in Italy, soldiers would rise from the ground. Soon he would have to discover whether reputation could raise trained legions as quickly as Caesar could march them. When Antony and the other fugitives reached Caesar, the governor summoned his troops. Before him stood men hardened by nearly a decade of campaigning, but the order he needed from them was different from anything he had asked before. A Gaul could be described as an enemy of Rome. Pompey's soldiers carried Roman standards, obeyed Roman magistrates, and might include old comrades from the same campaigns. Caesar spoke of the insults done to him and of Pompey's jealousy. He pointed to the tribunes, whose veto had failed to protect them. He reminded the legionaries that their achievements were also threatened, because a political defeat for their commander could place their rewards and reputations in the hands of his enemies. Caesar's own account says the soldiers cried out that they were ready to defend him and the tribunes. That response gave him loyalty, but it did not give him overwhelming numbers. Most of his army remained in winter quarters across Gaul. Near Ravenna, he had the 13th Legion, probably somewhere between 3,500 and 5,000 men available, rather than a full formation at its theoretical strength. Pompey and the Senate could call on Italy's enormous reserves, the Spanish armies, allied rulers, fleets, and the rich eastern provinces. If Caesar waited until those resources were assembled, his veterans might face a force many times their size. He therefore chose the weapon that had carried him through Gaul: speed before certainty. The 13th would cross first, while orders summoned the other legions to follow. Caesar would strike at the nearest centers of communication, force towns to make decisions before Pompey could protect them, and present every surrender as proof that Italy welcomed him. It was an enormous risk. Dividing even one legion among several objectives could leave each detachment vulnerable if a serious enemy formation appeared. The first target was Ariminum, modern Rimini, near the Adriatic coast. Its value came from the roads passing through it. The Via Aemilia ran northwest into the Po Valley, while the Via Flaminia connected the area toward the heart of Italy and Rome. Whoever controlled Ariminum possessed a gateway through which men, messages, and supplies could move. If Caesar seized it before an alarm spread, Pompey would lose the best place to stop him, near the provincial boundary. There was another reason to hurry. Every hour Caesar remained near Rubicon gave messengers time to ride south. Once Pompey knew where the 13th was concentrated, he could order bridges destroyed, reinforce towns, and gather his scattered cohorts behind a defensible line. Caesar had crossed with too few men to conduct a slow campaign. His invasion could survive only by moving faster than the political shock it created. The column advanced through the night or early morning, carrying shields, pila, tools, food, and the standards that made its purpose unmistakable. These were not raiders slipping across a frontier. A Roman legion brought its law, discipline, and engineering skill wherever it marched. Centurions kept the ranks moving, while scouts went ahead, searching for blocked roads or messengers who might give warning. Ariminum did not become the scene of a major battle. Caesar entered and took control before organized resistance could form. The absence of bloodshed made the event more alarming, not less. A legally forbidden boundary had been crossed, a strategic town had fallen, and the Senate's defenders had not fired a meaningful shot. Mark Antony and the other tribunes joined Caesar there. Orders followed quickly. 5 cohorts were sent under Antony toward Arretium, far to the southwest, threatening the routes through Etruria. Other detachments moved toward Pisorum, Fanum Fortunae, and Ancona along the Adriatic. Curio was assigned 3 cohorts and directed toward Iguvium. By scattering his limited force, Caesar created the impression of an invasion spreading across central Italy. Each detachment now depended on hesitation among the defenders. One determined Pompeian commander, with a concentrated veteran force, might defeat an isolated group before Caesar could help it. Yet the local garrisons saw only fragments of a rapidly changing picture. Reports arrived late and often exaggerated. A town told that Caesar had entered Ariminum could not know whether 1 legion stood behind him or 6. The first reactions favored Caesar. Some garrisons withdrew rather than risk being trapped. Local councils considered whether closing their gates would bring a siege and confiscation, while opening them might spare the inhabitants. Caesar's reputation for victory frightened them, but his restraint gave them somewhere safe to retreat. He was already turning clemency into a weapon. Those who yielded could expect to live, and soldiers who abandoned Pompeian officers might be accepted into his ranks. Far to the south, Pompey began receiving messages from roads that no longer felt secure. One reported Caesar at Ariminum. Another suggested detachments were moving in several directions. Towns that should have delayed the invasion were negotiating or opening their gates. Pompey had military experience far beyond most of the senators surrounding him, and the reports presented an ugly truth. Italy contained immense manpower, but Caesar had arrived before that manpower had become an army. The senators expected Pompey to defend Rome, yet Rome itself was not a strong fortress prepared for siege. Filling it with untrained recruits could trap the government inside a frightened population while Caesar's veterans approached along the roads. Pompey needed to gather his cohorts, preserve experienced units, and avoid the early battle Caesar wanted. Every military reason pointed toward withdrawal, but every mile of retreat would make him look weaker. Then another report arrived. Caesar's men were continuing south, and the towns ahead were already deciding whether Pompey could reach them in time. The same pattern spread down the Adriatic coast. Fanum Fortunae offered no meaningful resistance, and Ancona, a valuable harbour farther south, was occupied before Pompey could establish a defensive line. Each success gave Caesar food, shelter, intelligence, and control of another stretch of road. More important, every open gate freed his soldiers to continue moving, instead of losing days behind walls. At Iguvium, the Pompeian commander Quintus Minucius Thermus had 5 cohorts under his authority. On paper, that was enough to contest Curio's approach. Inside the town, however, Thermus could not trust the population. Residents showed little willingness to endure a siege, and rumors credited Caesar with far more troops than Curio actually brought. Rather than risk being trapped between a hostile town and an approaching enemy, Thermus withdrew. His soldiers then began slipping away to their homes. Titus Labienus now arrived in the Pompeian camp. For years, Labienus had been Caesar's most important subordinate in Gaul, commanding armies independently and sharing responsibility for some of the hardest victories. When civil war threatened, he chose Pompey. His defection encouraged Caesar's enemies, who hoped other senior officers and perhaps entire units would follow him. Inside Rome, confidence continued to drain. Families packed valuables, creditors demanded payment, and men with country estates considered which road might remain open. Memories of Sulla's occupation gave every rumor a darker shape. Citizens who had never seen Caesar's army imagined Gaulish auxiliaries and hardened legionaries descending on the city, while politicians wondered whose names might appear on the next lists of condemned men. Pompey did not intend to let Rome become a trap. He ordered magistrates and senators to leave, declaring that anyone who remained would be regarded as siding with Caesar. The command placed men under immediate pressure. Those who departed abandoned homes, clients, records, and political authority. Those who stayed risked being branded traitors if Pompey returned victorious. The evacuation unfolded with little of the dignity Rome expected from its rulers. Consuls, senators, servants, wagons, and frightened families crowded the roads. Some officials left without completing essential arrangements, while the state treasury remained behind. Pompey had chosen to preserve the government and its military leadership rather than defend the capital, but the retreat looked like panic to people who could not see the strategy behind it. Still, Pompey's withdrawal was not simply cowardice. Fighting near Rome with untrained men would give Caesar exactly what he needed: a quick, decisive engagement against troops not ready to face the veterans of Gaul. Pompey possessed ships, overseas allies, armies in Spain, and access to the resources of the eastern Mediterranean. If he preserved himself and the consuls, he could surrender ground now and build a far more dangerous war later. The first serious test came at Auximum. Publius Attius Varus held the town for Pompey and had brought in a garrison. As Caesar approached, the local magistrates confronted Varus. They told him they could not accept closing their gates against a commander whose achievements had brought Rome enormous victories and whose power was now advancing directly toward them. Varus could try to impose obedience, but the walls were useful only if the inhabitants helped defend them. A hostile population might open a gate at night, refuse supplies, or attack the garrison from behind. He therefore led his troops out and attempted to withdraw. Caesar's advance guard pursued, caught the column, and forced a brief engagement. The encounter did not develop into a sustained battle. Once fighting began, many of Varus's men abandoned him. Some went home, others crossed directly to Caesar, including Lucius Pupius, a senior centurion who had previously served in Pompey's army. Varus escaped with only a reduced following, while Auximum welcomed Caesar. Farther south, Lentulus Spinther abandoned Asculum with 10 cohorts, but soon began losing men to desertion. He eventually encountered Lucius Vibullius Rufus, whom Pompey had sent into Picenum to restore control. Vibullius gathered what remained and searched the surrounding districts for other units. After assembling 13 cohorts from scattered garrisons, he hurried toward Corfinium, where Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was building a larger concentration. For the first time, Caesar faced the prospect of an enemy force substantial enough to stop his advance. Reports indicated that Domitius had around 20 cohorts of his own, and Vibullius's arrival could raise the total to more than 30. Even at reduced strength, that represented perhaps 12,000 men, protected by walls and positioned across Caesar's path. Against fresh recruits in the open, veterans might prevail. Attacking them inside a fortified town would be far more costly. Pompey saw a different danger. A large body of raw troops at Corfinium could be surrounded and lost. He wanted Domitius to withdraw south and unite with the main force, creating an army too strong for Caesar to attack lightly. Letters traveled between the commanders, but Domitius believed the situation offered him a greater opportunity. At Corfinium, Domitius tried to bind his soldiers to the defense. He promised each man 4 iugera of land from his own estates, roughly 2.5 modern acres, if they held the town. The offer revealed both his wealth and his anxiety. Men confident of relief did not usually need to be promised farms before the battle began. 3 miles from the town, a bridge crossed the route Caesar needed. 5 Pompeian cohorts were sent to break it before his vanguard arrived. If they destroyed the crossing, the river and damaged bridge could delay the veterans long enough for Domitius to improve his position or reconsider evacuation. The demolition was still underway when Caesar's leading troops appeared. Soldiers working on the bridge dropped tools and reached for shields as centurions formed the approaching cohorts for action. The confined ground prevented either side from deploying a full battle line. Men fought for access to the crossing, while those behind pushed forward without knowing how many enemies waited beyond it. Caesar's veterans drove the 5 cohorts back. The defenders could not finish destroying the bridge and retreated toward Corfinium, where the gates admitted them before the pursuers could follow. The first physical obstacle had failed, and Domitius's men had been beaten within sight of the place they were expected to defend. Caesar crossed and established a fortified camp outside the town on February 15th. Legionaries marked the perimeter, dug ditches, raised an earthwork, and organized guards before darkness left them exposed. These routines had protected them through years in hostile territory. Now the same tools were being used to contain other Romans. Domitius placed men along the walls and sent another urgent appeal to Pompey. He argued that Caesar could be trapped if a relief army approached from the south. With more than 30 cohorts and several prominent senators inside Corfinium, he insisted that the opportunity was too important to abandon. The danger changed when word came from Sulmo, about 7 miles beyond Corfinium. The town's inhabitants were sympathetic to Caesar, but 7 Pompeian cohorts held the position. Caesar sent Antony with 5 cohorts of the 13th to test their resolve, reducing the veteran force around his own camp at a moment when Domitius still outnumbered him. Antony approached carrying Caesar's standards where the defenders could see them. The people of Sulmo opened the gates and came out to meet him, leaving the garrison with no dependable town to defend. The 7 cohorts surrendered and joined Caesar's side. 2 Pompeian commanders attempted to escape. One was captured and brought back. Then the 8th Legion arrived, followed by 22 newly raised cohorts and 300 cavalrymen supplied by the king of Noricum. Caesar placed part of the reinforcement under Curio in a separate camp on the opposite side of Corfinium. The town was no longer confronting 2 exposed veteran legions. A ring was forming around it. Pompey finally answered. His message did not contain a march route or an arrival date. He reminded Domitius that the stand at Corfinium had been taken against his advice and refused to risk the main army in a northern advance. Domitius read the letter and concealed its meaning from his soldiers. Publicly, he announced that Pompey was on the way. Privately, he began looking for a path out of the town. The truth moved through Corfinium faster than Domitius could contain it. Officers who had seen Pompey's message understood that no relief army was coming, while soldiers on the walls watched Caesar's fortifications close around them. Domitius had asked these men to defend the town, promised them land, and assured them that Pompey was marching north. Now rumors said he was preparing to escape alone. That night, senior officers gathered to decide what to do. They were not debating whether the walls could survive an assault. Caesar had not yet ordered one. Their immediate danger came from inside their own command. If Domitius slipped away, the soldiers would be left without the man who had brought them to Corfinium and without the general supposedly coming to rescue them. The officers placed Domitius under guard and sent representatives to Caesar. They offered to open the gates, surrender the town, and deliver the men responsible for its defense. In return, they asked that their lives be spared. A siege that might have cost thousands of Roman lives was ending, because the relationship between a commander and his troops had broken before the walls did. Morning brought no execution ground. Caesar ordered the senators, magistrates, military tribunes, and equestrians in the town to be brought before him. Around 50 prominent men appeared, including Domitius, Lentulus Spinther, Vibullius Rufus, and members of their families. They expected the victor to decide which of them would live. Caesar addressed them in front of his officers. He reminded several that he had helped them in the past and accused them of answering those favors by joining the attempt to destroy him. The speech served more than anger. Soldiers, townspeople, and political prisoners were watching to see whether the man who had crossed into Italy intended to become another Sulla. He released them. Domitius and the others were allowed to leave, even though many would soon rejoin Pompey. When 6 million sesterces from the public funds at Corfinium were handed over, Caesar returned the money, rather than appearing eager to seize it from a defeated rival. The gesture cost him resources at a time when he needed to pay an expanding army, but the story of it would travel farther than any official proclamation. The soldiers of the garrison received different orders. Their 30 or more cohorts were placed under Caesarian command, though their precise later disposition is uncertain. Men who had been recruited to stop the invasion now increased the strength of the invader. Caesar had taken a fortified town, captured prominent enemies, and added thousands of troops without ordering a general assault. His clemency was not simply mercy. If resistance ended in massacre, every Pompeian town would fight behind its walls until the last possible moment. By releasing Domitius, Caesar made surrender safer than continued loyalty to Pompey. That calculation would spare lives, preserve Italian towns, and accelerate the collapse of organized resistance. For the moment, Corfinium gave Caesar what he needed most: momentum. He remained there only 7 days before turning south through Apulia. Pompey was already withdrawing from Luceria toward Canusium, gathering whatever troops he could, while the consuls moved closer to the coast. The contest had become a race for Brundisium, Italy's principal gateway to Greece. Envoys carried another proposal ahead of Caesar's advancing army. Caesar offered to withdraw and dismiss his forces if Pompey also relinquished his command, but Pompey answered with conditions of his own. Caesar would have to abandon the towns he had occupied, return to his province, and disband first. Only then would Pompey depart for Spain and negotiations resume. To Caesar, that meant surrendering every advantage gained since Rubicon and trusting enemies who had already demanded his prosecution. The envoys moved between armies, while both commanders continued marching. Neither paused long enough to let diplomacy interfere with military preparation. Words offered each side a defense before Roman opinion. The roads showed what they actually expected. Pompey moved toward the ships, and Caesar followed with 6 legions. The first major evacuation began before Caesar reached Brundisium. The consuls crossed the Adriatic with a substantial part of the army, reportedly taking around 30 cohorts toward Dyrrachium. Pompey remained behind with approximately 20, organizing the embarkation and protecting the port. His decision placed him under immediate danger, but leaving too soon might have trapped thousands of soldiers and surrendered the ships in disorder. Caesar arrived outside Brundisium on March 9th. Unlike the inland towns that had opened their gates, this port offered Pompey a secure line of retreat as long as vessels could enter and leave the harbour. Caesar's land army could surround the walls, but soldiers standing on a shoreline could not stop ships beyond the reach of their pila. Caesar had no fleet ready to seal the exit. Ships requested from Gaul, Picenum, and the Strait of Messina would take too long to arrive, especially during the uncertain weather of late winter. Waiting would guarantee Pompey's escape. Caesar therefore ordered his legionaries to transform the harbour itself. Work began from both shores of the entrance. Soldiers carried stone, timber, and earth to construct moles extending into the water. Where the depth made fixed embankments impossible, they built rafts roughly 30 feet square, anchored them in place, and covered them with earth so men could stand and fight upon them. Towers rose on the platforms, giving archers and artillery a position above approaching boats. Pompey responded by converting merchant vessels into floating assault platforms. Towers were built on their decks, and coverings protected crews from missiles. These ships carried archers, slingers, and engines capable of striking Caesar's labor parties. They attacked the works, attempted to tow away rafts, and forced the legionaries to build while shields and protective structures absorbed incoming fire. Pompey understood the danger and concealed his schedule. Streets leading toward the waterfront were obstructed, and trenches were dug across the main routes. Sharpened stakes and heavy timbers were placed inside, then covered with hurdles and earth to create hidden traps. Approaches from outside the walls were blocked in the same manner, turning any rapid pursuit into a confused struggle through unfamiliar streets. As evening approached, the final movement began. Soldiers left their positions in controlled groups and moved toward the ships by routes they had already rehearsed. The rearguard stayed on the walls, maintaining the appearance of a normal defense, while transports filled below. Noise had to be contained. A single warning shouted too early might bring Caesar's assault columns against the gates before the embarkation was complete. Pompey had anticipated that reaction. At an agreed signal, the light troops on the towers withdrew and ran to the harbour. Caesar's soldiers placed ladders, climbed the walls, and entered the town, only to receive warnings from residents about the concealed ditches and stakes. A headlong pursuit through the dark could impale men, break formations, and block entire streets with wounded soldiers. 2 troopships became entangled with the obstacles Caesar had built and were captured. The rest passed through. From the shore, legionaries watched the fleet carry Pompey beyond their reach. After losing town after town across Italy, he had preserved himself, the consuls, and the foundation of another army. Caesar entered Brundisium as master of the peninsula, but his principal enemy had escaped. Had Pompey been trapped there, the civil war might have ended before either commander transported a major army overseas. Instead, Caesar's rapid Italian campaign had driven the conflict into regions where Pompey's advantages were strongest. Caesar therefore made a decision that surprised men, expecting an immediate pursuit. He turned away from the Adriatic. Pompey would be allowed time to build his army in the east because the Spanish threat had to be removed first. Before leaving Italy, Caesar went to Rome. The city he approached was not defended by Pompey's legions, but that did not mean it welcomed him without fear. Senators who remained wondered whether his promises of clemency would survive once he controlled the capital. Citizens remembered that every Roman general who entered political life with troops claimed necessity before settling accounts with his enemies. A more immediate dispute concerned the state treasury. Before fleeing, the consuls had left it sealed beneath the temple of Saturn. The tribune Lucius Caecilius Metellus stood before the doors and attempted to prevent Caesar from taking the funds. Caesar needed the money for soldiers, supplies, and the fleet required to continue the war, but forcing the treasury would expose the limits of his claim that he was merely defending lawful rights. Metellus refused to move. Caesar threatened him, warning that killing him would be easier than issuing the threat. Under pressure, the tribune finally yielded, and Caesar's men opened the treasury. The gold and silver accumulated for Rome's emergencies now financed the general whose crossing had created the emergency. Beyond the Pyrenees, Pompey's commanders had no intention of dissolving, as the garrisons in Italy had done. Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius concentrated 5 legions near Ilerda in northeastern Hispania, supported by thousands of Spanish infantry and cavalry. Their position overlooked the river Sicoris and controlled the roads through the region. Caesar had crossed Italy before Pompey could organize it. In Spain, he faced an enemy already waiting. Caesar reached the theatre before all his supplies were secure. Heavy spring rains raised the rivers, destroyed bridges, and interrupted the grain convoys feeding his army. For days, his soldiers watched the Sicoris surge between them and safety, while rations diminished. Pompeian cavalry ranged across the countryside, attacking foragers and preventing local communities from bringing food into Caesar's camp. Caesar's engineers responded by building light boats framed with timber and covered in hides, a design he had encountered during his campaigns in Britain. The boats were carried by wagon, assembled away from enemy observation, and used to send troops across the river. Once a bridgehead was secured, legionaries built a new crossing. Food began moving again, and Caesar's cavalry regained access to the country beyond the floodwater. The repaired supply line changed the contest. Afranius and Petreius abandoned their position and attempted to retreat toward the Ebro, where they hoped to reach friendly ground. Caesar pursued without allowing his men the rest they expected. Columns marched across difficult terrain, searching for routes that would place them ahead of the Pompeians without forcing an immediate battle. At one point, the two armies came close enough for soldiers to recognize acquaintances across the lines. Men approached one another, spoke of peace, and discussed ending a war in which Roman citizens had no desire to kill former comrades. Petreius saw the fraternization and reacted violently. He drove Caesar's soldiers from his camp, punished his own men, and compelled them to renew their oath to Pompey. The reconciliation ended, but the military situation continued to worsen for the Pompeian army. Caesar used earthworks, cavalry, and repeated movements to cut access to water and block the routes of escape. Rather than launch an assault that would leave thousands dead, he tightened control until Afranius and Petreius could no longer feed or move their troops. They surrendered. Caesar dismissed much of the defeated army after requiring guarantees that the men would not resume the fight. Once again, he had removed a major force without a massacre. Spain no longer threatened his rear, but the months consumed there had given Pompey exactly what he needed: time. By the end of 49 BC, Pompey had transformed his retreat into a formidable military position. At Dyrrhachium on the eastern Adriatic, ships brought men, weapons, money, and grain from across the Roman East. Senators who had fled Italy joined kings, provincial governors, and experienced officers. Their coalition was divided by pride and personal rivalries, yet it possessed resources Caesar could not ignore. Caesar returned to Brundisium and found fewer ships than he needed. The transports available could not carry his entire army in one voyage. Winter storms threatened the crossing, and Pompeian warships patrolled the sea. Waiting until spring would allow Pompey to grow stronger. Sailing immediately meant dividing the army, while an enemy fleet controlled the waters between its halves. In early January 48 BC, Caesar embarked with approximately 7 understrength legions, perhaps 15,000 infantry in total, and only a small contingent of cavalry. Men crowded aboard transports without enough room for the normal quantity of baggage. After crossing at night, the fleet reached the coast of Epirus, near Palaeste, before Pompey's patrols could intercept it. Caesar grew desperate enough to attempt the sea crossing himself. Disguised as a private traveller, he boarded a small boat at night and ordered its crew toward Brundisium. A storm drove against the vessel near the mouth of the river Aus, and the sailors prepared to turn back. According to later tradition, Caesar revealed himself and told the helmsman that he carried Caesar and Caesar's fortune, but even his confidence could not calm the sea. The boat returned to shore. Soon afterward, Antony finally crossed with 4 legions and several hundred cavalry. Pompey tried to intercept him, but Antony landed north of Caesar, and the 2 Caesarian forces maneuvered until they united. The immediate threat of isolation had passed. Caesar now had enough men to challenge Pompey, though he remained weaker in cavalry and supplies. Pompey withdrew toward Dyrrhachium, where his stores and fleet gave him a secure base. His camp occupied high ground south of the city near Petra, connected to the coast and supplied by ship. Caesar could not attack such a position without severe losses, and he lacked the fleet to sever Pompey's maritime lifeline. He chose a more audacious method, surrounding a larger army with a smaller one. Legionaries began building a chain of forts, ditches, walls, and connecting ramparts across miles of broken terrain. Caesar intended to restrict Pompey's cavalry, deny grazing land, and damage his prestige by making it appear that the conqueror of the East was trapped. Pompey answered with a shorter inner line of fortifications, using the terrain to hold key hills while ships continued delivering food. Conditions deteriorated inside both systems. Pompey's horses ran short of fodder, and dead or weakened animals accumulated near the camps. Caesar's soldiers suffered a different shortage. Grain was scarce, forcing them to dig for edible roots and make coarse bread from whatever they could find. Some threw the loaves toward the Pompeian lines, shouting that they would live on grass rather than release Pompey. Pompey finally discovered a weakness near the coast. 2 Gallic nobles serving under Caesar had been accused of withholding cavalry pay and defected to Pompey. They knew the layout of Caesar's works and revealed that one section near the sea remained incomplete, with 2 parallel walls intended to protect against attacks from both land and water, but not yet fully connected. Pompey prepared a concentrated assault. Legionaries attacked the outer positions, while light troops and archers landed from ships behind the unfinished defences. Caesar's men suddenly faced enemies from more than one direction. Cohorts rushed toward the breach, but narrow paths and unfinished earthworks disrupted their formations. Mark Antony initially held part of the line and prevented an immediate collapse. Caesar brought reinforcements and recovered some ground, then decided to strike a nearby Pompeian camp that appeared vulnerable. His soldiers entered through part of the defences, but hedges and walls divided the terrain in ways they had not anticipated. Units lost contact, and men began moving toward different objectives. Pompey sent cohorts against the exposed attackers. At the sight of fresh enemy troops, Caesar's formation faltered. Soldiers crowded toward ditches and ramparts, blocking one another's escape. Some were crushed in the confusion. Others abandoned standards as the retreat accelerated. Caesar tried to stop them. He seized fleeing men, called to standard bearers, and attempted to turn units back toward the enemy. According to his own account, panic carried the soldiers past him. Pompey had broken Caesar's line and won the clearest victory of the campaign. Yet Pompey halted rather than driving the attack into Caesar's disordered camp. He feared that the retreat might conceal a trap, or that troops advancing beyond their fortifications would lose cohesion. Caesar later remarked that the enemy would have won the war that day if only they had possessed a commander who knew how to win. Caesar assembled the army and addressed men shaken by defeat. He did not pretend the battle had gone well. Units had broken, standards had been lost, and centurions had died trying to hold their positions. He blamed panic and error, reminded the soldiers of earlier victories, and ordered the camp abandoned before Pompey could attack again. The retreat carried Caesar away from the coast and into Thessaly. Pompey followed more cautiously, while his allies celebrated as though the war had already ended. Inside the Pompeian camp, senators argued over the offices and properties they expected after returning to Rome. Some criticized Pompey for moving too slowly, demanding that he force Caesar into battle before the defeated army escaped. Pompey entered the region with a larger army and an overwhelming advantage in cavalry. The rival camps eventually stood near Pharsalus in August 48 BC, separated by ground suited to the mounted forces assembled from the east. Caesar repeatedly offered battle. Pompey initially remained near his camp, where the slope protected his line and made an attack costly. His plan centered on his cavalry. According to Caesar's own figures, which may be exaggerated, Pompey arranged approximately 45,000 infantry in 3 lines and placed perhaps 7,000 cavalry on his left under Titus Labienus. Caesar claimed about 22,000 infantry and roughly 1,000 cavalry. The imbalance on that wing was impossible to hide. From his position opposite Labienus, Caesar could see the mass of horsemen extending beyond his line. He removed selected cohorts from the 3rd line, perhaps 3,000 experienced infantry, and formed a concealed 4th line behind his cavalry. Their orders were specific. When the mounted wing gave ground, they were to advance together and drive their pila directly at the enemy cavalry, rather than throwing them at normal range. Caesar's main line began moving. As Pompey had ordered, his infantry waited. The advancing legionaries noticed that the enemy was not coming forward, halted partway across the field, recovered their breath, and then resumed the charge. Pompey's attempt to exhaust them had lost some of its effect because experienced soldiers adjusted without waiting for new commands. Caesar's smaller mounted force could not withstand it. His cavalry and supporting light infantry gave way, drawing the Pompeians forward. Labienus's horsemen began spreading out to turn against the exposed flank of Caesar's legions. From their position, victory appeared close. The enemy cavalry was retreating, and nothing substantial seemed to stand between them and the rear of Caesar's line. Then Caesar's hidden cohorts advanced. Instead of isolated cavalrymen chasing a broken enemy, Labienus's force met a compact wall of veteran infantry. The legionaries thrust upward with their pila, using the heavy weapons as spears against horses and riders at close range. Ancient accounts claimed they aimed at the riders' faces, but the essential effect came from disciplined infantry attacking cavalry that had lost order during pursuit. The Pompeian horsemen recoiled. Those in front tried to turn, while ranks behind continued moving forward, creating confusion across the wing. Caesar's cavalry rallied, and the fourth line pressed its attack. Within a short time, Pompey's greatest numerical advantage was fleeing from the battlefield. The concealed cohorts did not stop at the empty flank. They wheeled inward against Pompey's infantry, while Caesar committed his fresh third line from the front. Men who had been holding against one attack now faced another from the side, and the pressure spread along the formation. Pompey watched the cavalry disappear and returned to his camp. Whether he had already lost hope or went there to organize a defense cannot be known. On the field, his infantry continued fighting without the maneuver meant to secure their victory. Units began falling back, first in order and then with growing urgency as Caesar's flank attack moved behind them. Caesar ordered his men to spare Roman citizens where possible and concentrate on the allied troops who continued resisting. The command mixed clemency with battlefield calculation. Frightened Romans offered a path to surrender were less likely to fight to the death. Pompey's camp, filled with servants, baggage, and preparations for a victory feast, now became the destination of a defeated army. The ramparts did not hold for long. Caesar's legionaries stormed the defences and entered a camp whose occupants had expected to celebrate that evening. Tents contained decorated tables, silverware, and comforts that contrasted sharply with the privations Caesar's men had endured. The pursuit continued beyond the camp, toward the hills where thousands of Pompeians sought refuge. Pompey did not remain to see the surrender. He changed his clothing, left the camp with a small group, and rode toward the coast. Behind him lay the army assembled to restore the Republic and end Caesar's rebellion. Ahead waited a ship, Egypt, and rulers whose loyalty he had once believed secure. Pompey reached the Aegean coast with only a few companions. The insignia of command had disappeared, along with the senators who had crowded his headquarters and urged him to fight. He boarded a small vessel and moved from port to port, searching for a place where his name still carried enough weight to provide soldiers, money, or sanctuary. On September 28, 48 BC, a small boat rowed out to Pompey's ship near Pelusium. Among the men aboard was Lucius Septimius, a Roman officer who had once served under Pompey. His familiar face made the invitation appear safe. Cornelia watched from the larger vessel as her husband entered the boat and was carried toward the shore. Pompey tried to speak with Septimius, but the officer gave little response. As the boat reached shallow water and Pompey prepared to stand, the men around him drew their weapons. He covered his face with his toga and was stabbed before he could reach dry land. His body was left near the surf, while his severed head was taken away as a gift for Caesar. When Caesar arrived in Egypt several days later, an Egyptian courtier presented Pompey's head and signet ring. The gesture had been designed to win favor. Instead, Caesar turned away and wept, or at least allowed witnesses to remember him doing so. Pompey had been his ally, his son-in-law, and finally his greatest enemy. But he was still a Roman consul, murdered by foreigners without trial. The assassination did not end Caesar's danger. He entered Alexandria with only a few thousand soldiers and attempted to settle the dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra. The decision drew him into street fighting inside one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean. Egyptian forces surrounded the palace quarter, fighting through narrow roads and along the harbor, while Caesar waited for reinforcements. For months, the victor of Pharsalus was effectively trapped. His soldiers fortified buildings, protected the docks, and struggled to maintain access to water. During fighting near the harbor, Caesar was forced into the sea and swam to safety under missile fire, according to ancient accounts. The man who had pursued Pompey to the edge of the Roman world now risked dying in a local dynastic war. 3 more years of war carried Caesar through Egypt, Asia Minor, North Africa, and Spain before the last major Pompeian army was destroyed at Munda in 45 BC. He returned to a capital that had repeatedly received news of Roman armies killing one another, and the Senate loaded the victor with honors. His image appeared in places once reserved for gods and kings, his statue stood among those of Rome's ancient rulers, and his authority expanded beyond traditional limits. Early in 44 BC, he received the title Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for life. For senators who feared permanent one-man rule, those honors looked less like gratitude than the beginning of monarchy. Marcus Junius Brutus stood near the center of that opposition. Caesar had spared him after Pharsalus and treated him with favor, but Brutus carried a family name linked, through Roman tradition, to the expulsion of the kings. Anonymous messages reportedly appeared, urging him to act, while relatives and fellow senators questioned whether he would accept life under permanent dictatorship. Gaius Cassius Longinus brought greater experience and sharper hostility. Around Brutus and Cassius gathered dozens of conspirators, including former Pompeians pardoned by Caesar and men who had served Caesar but feared his power. They called themselves liberators. Their plan required killing Caesar in public before he left Rome with an army, while presenting the act as the lawful removal of a tyrant. Warnings reached Caesar during the days before the Senate meeting scheduled for March 15th. A soothsayer was said to have cautioned him about the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia experienced disturbing dreams and pleaded with him not to go. For a time, Caesar considered remaining at home. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, one of the conspirators and a man Caesar trusted, persuaded him to attend. Avoiding the meeting because of dreams would expose Caesar to ridicule and insult senators waiting to honor him. The decision placed him outside the protection of his household and among men who had rehearsed where they would stand. The Senate met in a hall attached to the theatre of Pompey because its usual chamber was unavailable. A statue of Pompey overlooked the room. Mark Antony, whose physical strength and loyalty might disrupt the attack, was detained in conversation outside by Trebonius. Inside, Lucius Tillius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition concerning his exiled brother. Other conspirators gathered as if supporting the request. When Caesar refused, Cimber pulled at his toga. The gesture exposed Caesar and signaled the others to move. Casca struck first and wounded him near the neck. Caesar turned, seized the weapon, and tried to resist, but blades appeared from every side. Senators not involved in the plot scattered from the chamber, while the conspirators crowded so closely that some wounded one another. Caesar received 23 wounds and fell near the base of Pompey's statue. Whether he spoke to Brutus cannot be established. The famous words "et tu, Brute" come from later tradition and literature, not a reliable record of the assassination. Ancient accounts variously describe a Greek phrase, a final reaction, or silence. What witnesses could agree upon was the body left on the floor and the assassins raising bloodied weapons in the name of liberty. The conspirators expected Romans to welcome them as liberators. They marched toward the Capitoline and called on the people to recover their freedom. Instead, shops closed and citizens retreated indoors. No restored republic appeared around them, because killing Caesar had not removed the soldiers, veterans, debts, rival ambitions, or weakened institutions that had made his supremacy possible. Mark Antony survived and gained access to Caesar's papers and property. At the funeral, Caesar's will was read, leaving money to Roman citizens and public use of his gardens. The crowd saw the blood-stained clothing and heard of the wounds. Anger spread through the forum, and the conspirators who had expected public gratitude found their houses threatened. Caesar's will also named an heir, his 18-year-old great-nephew, Gaius Octavius. The young man was across the Adriatic preparing for Caesar's planned eastern campaign when news arrived. Friends warned him that returning to Italy could be fatal. He came anyway, accepted Caesar's name, and began calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Octavian used Caesar's name and veterans to force his own election as consul, then joined Antony and Lepidus in the second triumvirate. Unlike the private arrangement once made by Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this triumvirate received formal legal powers to reorganize the state. Its leaders published proscription lists, reviving the method associated with Sulla. At Philippi in 42 BC, the armies of Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius, destroying the last organized force led by Caesar's assassins. The victors then divided the Roman world, but their alliance could not survive. Antony established himself in the east and joined Cleopatra, while Octavian tightened his control of the west. Their struggle ended at Actium in 31 BC, when Octavian's commander Agrippa shattered Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. By the following year, both were dead, and Octavian stood alone. In 27 BC, Octavian accepted the name Augustus and presented his supremacy through the language of republican restoration. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates continued to hold office, and elections did not disappear at once. Yet control of the principal armies, provinces, and political future rested with one ruler. The river offered no physical resistance. There were no enemy shields on the opposite bank, and no arrows falling into the water. A few steps carried Caesar from his province into Italy, but those steps changed the question governing Roman politics. Power would no longer be settled primarily by speeches, elections, or senatorial decrees. It would be settled by which commander could move first, hold his soldiers, and defeat the other Roman armies sent against him. On that winter night in 49 BC, Caesar crossed a river scarcely worthy of notice on a military map. What followed him was far larger than the 13th Legion. Personal loyalty crossed with him. Political fear crossed with him. The precedent that a Roman commander could place his army above the state crossed with him. The water closed behind the soldiers, but Rome never found its way back.